All right, let's jump right in. When we talk about the bedrock of modern democracy, things like individual rights, the right to own property, there's one name that always pops up: John Locke. He's held up as this great prophet of liberty, the guy who handed us the intellectual playbook for freedom. And this idea right here, this is Locke in a nutshell. The whole reason we even have governments, he says, is to protect our stuff. Our lives, sure, our liberty, you bet, but especially our property. For hundreds of years, this has been hailed as a revolutionary idea, a shield against tyranny. This is the John Locke we all learn about.
But what if there's a flip side to this story? What if that same philosophy, the one that champions freedom, also happens to be the perfect justification for taking things on a massive scale? That's the really challenging question we're digging into today, looking at Locke not just as some abstract thinker, but as a man of his time, with his feet firmly on the ground.
To really get this, we have to forget the image of Locke sitting alone in a dusty room just thinking big thoughts. John Locke wasn't just a man of ideas. He was a man of action, a man of capital, and a man of empire. He was right in the thick of the colonial project of the 17th century. And this is where it gets really, really revealing. Just take a look at this timeline. In 1669, Locke helps write a constitution for the Carolina colony that explicitly legalizes slavery. A few years on, he's investing his own money in the Royal African Company, which was a massive slave trading operation. All the while, he's a high-level colonial administrator. And it's only after all of this, in 1689, that his famous second treatise comes out. See, Locke wasn't just thinking about property in theory. He was actively profiting from a system built on stolen land and enslaved people while writing the very philosophy that would be used to defend it all. And let's be super clear about what he was doing. This wasn't some passive role. He was helping write colonial law, he was a shareholder in the slave trade, a key administrator for a colony, and on the board overseeing England's entire imperial machine. His philosophy didn't just appear out of nowhere. It grew directly out of his day job and, well, it lined up perfectly with his financial interests.
This quote just nails the consequence of all that. The argument is that Locke's work gave colonialism its moral cover. He took the brutal reality of seizing land and subjugating entire populations and dressed it up in the fancy language of reason and natural rights. He made conquest sound like a noble cause. So how did he pull it off? To get that, we have to pull apart his most famous idea, the labor theory of property. This is where the real philosophical sleight of hand happens. Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? If you head out into nature, clear some land, plant a field, and make it productive, you've mixed your labor with it. It should be yours. The act of improving the land is what gives you the right to own it. But there's a very clever trap hidden in that logic. Here's the catch. The whole theory only works if you get to decide what counts as unimproved or wasteland. And for Locke and his buddies, that conveniently included the massive territories of the Americas, even though people were living there. It also included the common lands back in England that peasants had used for centuries. Suddenly, their way of life didn't count as labor or improvement. So this elegant theory about labor, it becomes a perfect weapon for justifying taking land from others.
And that's the heart of it. Locke's theory wasn't just some neutral observation about natural rights. It was a prescription for a new world order. It gave the moral and legal green light for fencing off common lands in England, and, even more devastatingly, for the mass dispossession of indigenous peoples across the globe. It was, in essence, an alibi for theft.
Okay, but what about consent? Locke's other big idea is that government has to be based on the consent of the governed. That sounds like a safeguard, right? Well, let's take a closer look at what consent actually meant in his world.
Locke's argument for tacit consent is kind of a brilliant logical loop. Check this out. He says, first, society agrees to use money. Okay. Second, you have to use money to live, right? To buy food, to participate in the economy. But here's the twist. He says that by the very act of using money to survive, you are quietly agreeing to the entire system of property laws and the government that enforces them. The simple need to eat is twisted into a full-throated political endorsement. Your survival becomes your submission. Thinkers who came later, like C.B. Macpherson, just took this whole idea apart. Macpherson said Locke's philosophy is based on something he called possessive individualism. What's that? Basically, it's the idea that a person is first and foremost an owner of their body, their labor, and their property. But in a world where property is already divvied up, where inequality is the starting point, the consent of someone who has nothing isn't free at all. It's just what they have to do to get by. And James Tully really drives us home by putting it back into that colonial setting. For Indigenous peoples facing colonization, calling what happened consent to English property law is just absurd. It wasn't consent, it was a justification for force, pure and simple. So when you put all these pieces on the table, the colonial administrator, the convenient theory, the flimsy notion of consent, what you're left with is a legacy that is just profoundly contradictory. You have the beautiful language of liberty on one side and the brutal logic of theft on the other. What's really wild is how Locke pulled this off. He used all this secular language, talking about natural law instead of God. But if you look at the structure of his argument, it's basically theological. He just swapped out the old divine right of kings for a new one, the natural right of property owners. All of a sudden, ownership became just as holy and unquestionable as a king's crown used to be. So, from this point of view, the conclusion is pretty blunt. Locke's genius wasn't just in what he created, but in what he managed to hide in plain sight. He made the violent seizure of land look like a moral, rational act. He made submission look like freedom. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to this. You can wrap it up in the most beautiful philosophy. You can call it improvement. You can call it natural law. But it doesn't change what it is. A crime is still a crime, even when it's wearing a fancy intellectual disguise. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? Because John Locke's ideas genuinely did inspire people to fight for freedom and democracy all over the world. But at the same time, those exact same ideas were used to justify centuries of colonial violence and dispossession. So how do we hold those two things at our head at once? How do we make sense of a legacy of liberty that seems to be built, at least in part, on a logic of theft? That's something to chew on.